The temperature had dropped to 43 degrees below zero, and Otto Steinmann watched his neighbor's cabin across the valley, smoke pouring from its chimney, in desperation. Inside Otto's stone-lined shelter, buried beneath 3 feet of earth, his children slept under a single blanket, while a small fire glowed in the corner, the walls radiating warmth into air that held steady at 58 degrees. Before we continue, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale might just change how you think about survival. The year was 1855. The Wyoming Territory stretched wild and unforgiving across landscapes that killed careless men with methodical efficiency. Otto Steinmann had survived 4 winters in these mountains, trapping and hunting with his partner Friedrich Bauer, a German immigrant who had come west 3 years before Otto arrived. They had built a cabin together that autumn, a solid structure of notched pine logs with a stone fireplace and a thick plank door. It had taken them 6 days to complete, and they were proud of the work. The cabin sat in a narrow valley where 2 creeks converged, sheltered from the worst winds by steep ridges on 3 sides. It seemed like a good location. It seemed safe. The cold arrived in late December without warning. One morning, the temperature was 20 degrees below zero, which was normal for that time of year. By evening, it had dropped to 35 below. By midnight, it reached 40 below. By dawn of the second day, it was 43 degrees below zero, colder than either man had ever experienced. They kept the fire burning constantly. They fed it every piece of wood they had cut and stacked inside the cabin. They burned their spare furniture. They burned tools they could afford to lose. The fireplace roared with heat, flames climbing the chimney, sparks shooting into the black sky outside, but the cabin stayed cold. Otto woke on the 3rd morning to find Friedrich unconscious near the fireplace. His partner had been tending the fire during the night, while Otto slept. Friedrich had wrapped himself in both their blankets and sat as close to the flames as possible, but it had not been enough. The cold had penetrated the cabin despite their efforts. The logs, chinked with moss and mud, leaked heat through 1,000 invisible gaps. The floor, packed earth, conducted cold upward from the frozen ground. The walls, exposed to wind and brutal temperatures, could not hold warmth. Otto dragged Friedrich closer to the fire and piled every remaining blanket on him, but his partner never regained consciousness. Friedrich Bauer died 4 hours later, frozen to death inside a cabin with a roaring fire less than 6 feet away. Otto buried Friedrich when the cold finally broke 5 days later. He dug the grave on a hillside overlooking the valley, breaking through frozen earth. With an iron bar and shovel, working for 2 days to create a hole deep enough. He marked it with stones and stood there alone, understanding something that would consume him for the next year. The cabin had failed. The construction everyone accepted as proper and sufficient had killed his partner. Wood and mud and standard frontier building methods were not enough. There had to be a better way. Otto left the mountains in February 1856 and traveled to Fort Laramie to sell his winter's furs. The journey took 9 days through snow and bitter wind. He spent 2 weeks at the fort selling pelts, buying supplies, and doing something other trappers found peculiar. He spent hours examining the fort's stone buildings, studying how the masons had laid stones, how they fitted corners, how they built foundations that would not shift or settle. The soldiers thought he was strange, this German trapper, walking around the fortifications, touching walls, and asking questions about construction techniques. But Otto was learning. He returned to the valley in early March with specific plans forming in his mind. The cabin where Friedrich had died stood empty. Otto could not bring himself to sleep there. Instead, he built a crude lean-to shelter against a south-facing rock outcrop and began thinking through a problem that most men would have simply accepted. How do you build shelter that will not fail when the temperature drops to 40 below? He remembered something from his childhood in Bavaria. His grandfather had kept root vegetables in a stone-lined cellar, dug into a hillside behind the family farm. That cellar stayed cool in summer and never froze in winter. The old man had explained it once. The earth itself holds temperature. Dig deep enough and the ground stays the same year-round. Warm in winter, cool in summer. Stone holds heat from fire and gives it back slowly. Put them together properly, and you need little fuel to stay warm. The idea seemed impossible at first. Frontier cabins were built from logs, because timber was abundant and log construction was fast. Stone structures required different skills and far more labor. But Otto kept returning to the fundamental problem. Wood exposed to air cannot hold heat. Earth surrounding stone can. He began gathering stones in April, not just any stones, but flat ones that could be stacked in courses like bricks. He found them in creek beds, on hillsides, anywhere water or ancient ice had shaped rock into roughly rectangular pieces. Other trappers passing through the valley saw him loading stones onto a crude sled pulled by his mule and thought he had lost his mind. One man, a trapper named Miller from Ohio, stopped to ask what Otto was doing. Otto explained he was building a new kind of shelter, one that used stone and earth instead of logs. Miller laughed and told him he was wasting his time. Logs were everywhere, free for the cutting. Stone had to be gathered, one piece at a time, hauled to the site, fitted together. It would take months to build what could be accomplished with logs in a week. Otto listened and continued gathering stones. He had watched Friedrich die in a log cabin with a roaring fire. He would not make the same mistake twice. By early May, he had collected over 300 flat stones, stacked them near his chosen building site, and begun the real work. He was going to dig into the earth itself. Otto selected his building site with obsessive care. Most trappers built near water for convenience. Otto chose a spot on elevated ground 50 yards from the creek, on a gentle south-facing slope that would receive maximum winter sun. The location provided good drainage and allowed him to dig into the hillside rather than straight down into flat ground. He marked out a rectangle 12 feet wide and 16 feet long, larger than most mountain cabins, and began excavating in mid-May 1856. The digging consumed 6 weeks of brutal labor. Otto worked alone with a shovel, pickaxe, and iron pry bar. The first 2 feet of soil came out relatively easily, dark earth mixed with roots and rocks. Below that, he hit harder packed clay that required the pickaxe to break apart. He dug deeper, removing earth one shovelful at a time, piling it carefully nearby because he would need it later. At 4 feet down, the earth temperature changed noticeably. Even on warm spring days, the exposed soil felt cool to the touch. At 6 feet down, the temperature stabilized. Otto could feel it. The earth at that depth maintained a constant coolness, regardless of the air temperature above. That was what he needed. He dug the floor level at 6 feet below the original ground surface on the downhill side, which meant the uphill side was only 4 feet deep since he was working into a slope. This created a natural entrance point where the structure would emerge from the hillside. The excavation itself became the foundation. Otto shaped the floor carefully, sloping it slightly toward the entrance for drainage. He dug a narrow trench around the perimeter, 6 inches deep, where the stone walls would sit. Then he lined the floor with flat stones, fitting them together like a puzzle, creating a surface that would not turn to mud and would help maintain the stable temperature he was building the structure to achieve. Settlers passing through the valley that spring spread word about Steinman's project. They called it Erickson's grave, a joke that made the rounds in Fort Laramie and at the few scattered homesteads within 100 miles. The German trapper was digging a hole in the ground, they said, wasting the entire building season on what looked like a root cellar or a tomb. Some thought he had gone mad with grief over his partner's death. Others assumed he was building elaborate cold storage for furs or meat. No one believed he intended to live in it. Why would anyone choose to live underground when timber was abundant and log cabin construction was proven and reliable? Otto ignored the mockery. He had learned something watching Friedrich die that the mockers did not understand. Reliable construction had failed. Proven methods had killed his partner. The answer was not to do the same thing better, but to do something entirely different. By the end of June, the excavation was complete. The hole sat empty, waiting. Now came the part that would either prove his theory or waste 6 months of labor. He began laying stone. Otto began laying stones in early July 1856. He started at the corners, selecting the largest and flattest pieces from his stockpile. Each stone was placed carefully, tested for stability, adjusted until it sat level and solid. He worked without mortar, using a technique called dry stacking that relied on weight, friction, and precise fitting to create stability. Mortar would have been stronger, but Otto had no lime and no way to make proper mortar in the quantities he needed. Dry stacking meant each stone had to be selected and placed with absolute precision. The first course went down slowly. Otto walked back and forth between his stone pile and the excavation hundreds of times each day, examining stones, rejecting most, selecting only those that fit the specific space he was trying to fill. A stone that was too thick would throw off the level. A stone that was too thin would create instability. A stone with the wrong shape would leave gaps that would weaken the wall. He learned to see stones differently, not as individual rocks, but as three-dimensional puzzle pieces that had to interlock with the pieces above, below, and beside them. The walls rose at a rate of roughly 3 inches per day. Each course had to be perfectly level before he started the next. Otto used a wooden frame with a suspended weight, a plumb line he had made himself, to check vertical alignment. He used a straight board balanced on the wall with a small bottle of water set on top to check horizontal level. If the water in the bottle tilted, the course was not level, and he adjusted stones until it was. The process was maddening in its slowness, but Otto understood that every stone placed correctly now meant strength and stability that would last decades. By late July, the walls had risen 2 feet above the floor. Otto began noticing something interesting. On hot summer days, the air inside the excavation stayed noticeably cooler than the air outside. The earth surrounding the pit was acting as insulation, moderating the temperature. At night, when the air outside cooled rapidly, the air inside the pit stayed warmer. The stone walls absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. The effect was subtle, but measurable. Otto realized he was not just building walls, he was creating a thermal battery surrounded by insulation. The stone walls eventually reached 4 feet high on all sides. At that point, they emerged just above ground level on the downhill side where the entrance would be. Otto left a gap in the wall 4 feet wide for the doorway. The walls continued upward on either side of the entrance, curving slightly inward as they rose, creating the beginning of a dome shape. By mid-August, the walls stood 6 feet tall at their highest point. They had consumed over 200 stones and represented 7 weeks of continuous labor. Otto stepped back and examined his work. The structure looked strange, like a stone collar emerging from the earth, but the walls were solid, stable, and exactly what he needed. Now came the roof. The roof presented Otto's greatest engineering challenge. Stone walls could support tremendous weight if that weight was distributed evenly, but creating a roof structure that would spread the load properly required careful planning. Otto began by cutting and hauling lodgepole pines from a grove 2 miles up the valley. He selected trees that were straight, roughly 8 inches in diameter, and long enough to span the width of his structure with several feet of overhang on each side. He cut 12 of these poles, stripped them of bark, and let them dry for 2 weeks. In early September, he began roof construction. He laid the poles across the stone walls, spacing them roughly 18 inches apart. The poles rested directly on the top course of stones, and Otto notched shallow depressions in the stones so the poles would sit securely and not roll. The poles extended 2 feet beyond the walls on all sides, creating an overhang that would help shed water away from the structure. Over these primary poles he laid smaller branches, woven together to create a lattice. The lattice did not need to support weight by itself, it only needed to hold the layers that would come next. Over the lattice, Otto laid sheets of bark he had harvested from cottonwood trees along the creek. The bark pieces overlapped like shingles, creating the first waterproof layer. Over the bark he spread a layer of dried grass and pine needles, creating a mat roughly 4 inches thick. Then came the critical layer. Otto began hauling earth, the same earth he had excavated months earlier, and spreading it over the entire roof structure. He worked systematically, adding soil in thin layers, tamping each layer down before adding the next. The earth layer grew slowly, 6 inches, then 12 inches, then 18 inches. By late September, the earth covering was 2 feet thick across the entire roof and dome structure. The weight was enormous, thousands of pounds pressing down on the stone walls and roof poles, but everything held. The stones distributed the weight evenly. The poles, laid close together, shared the load. Otto added a final layer, cutting thick sections of prairie sod and laying them grass-side up over the entire structure. The sod would root and grow, creating a living roof that would prevent erosion and add additional insulation. The door required 3 weeks to build. Otto used thick planks he had laboriously sawn by hand from a large pine. Each plank was 3 inches thick, fitted together with tongue and groove joints. He reinforced the door with diagonal braces in a Z pattern and hung it on iron hinges he had purchased at Fort Laramie the previous winter. The hinges were massive, each weighing 12 pounds, and they were mounted using iron pins driven through both the door frame and the adjacent stone wall. The door was so heavy it took all of Otto's strength to swing it open, but once closed it sealed the entrance completely. He built a wooden frame for ventilation near the roof peak, a small opening 8 inches square that could be covered from inside with a wooden shutter. The ventilation hole would allow smoke to escape and fresh air to enter while being too small for weather or animals to penetrate. By mid-October 1856, the structure was complete. Otto moved his supplies inside, built a small stone hearth in one corner, and lit his first fire. The stones warmed slowly, and the warmth stayed. Otto spent the first night in his stone shelter on October 18, 1856. He had built a sleeping platform from planks, raised 2 feet off the stone floor to avoid cold rising from the ground. His possessions fit easily in the space. Traps and tools hung on wooden pegs driven into gaps between stones. Food supplies sat on shelves he had built into alcoves he had left in the stone walls during construction. The interior measured 12 feet by 16 feet with a ceiling height of 7 feet at the center, sloping down to 5 feet at the walls where they met the roof structure. The space felt larger than it was because the stone walls reflected the light from his fire and oil lamp. He lit a small fire in the stone hearth that first evening, using maybe a third of the wood he would have burned in his old log cabin. Within an hour he noticed the difference. The stones near the fire warmed to the touch. That warmth spread slowly through the wall, radiating outward and into the room. The air temperature rose steadily, and more importantly, it stayed warm. There were no drafts. No cold air leaked through gaps in the walls. The earth covering the roof prevented heat from escaping upward. By the time Otto let the fire burn down to coals around midnight, the interior temperature had reached a comfortable 60 degrees. He slept under a single blanket and woke 6 hours later to find the air still warm, the stones still radiating stored heat, though the fire had gone completely out. The discovery changed everything. In a log cabin, the fire had to burn constantly, or the interior temperature would drop within an hour. Here, a fire burned for 2 hours could keep the space comfortable for 8 or 10 hours. The stone walls were acting exactly as Otto had theorized, absorbing heat when the fire burned and releasing it slowly after the fire died. The earth surrounding the structure prevented that heat from escaping. The result was a shelter that required minimal fuel to maintain livable temperatures. Word of Otto's underground dwelling spread quickly through the scattered frontier community. Trappers and settlers began referring to it as Steinmann's Cellar, or the Stone Tomb, names that carried mockery and disbelief. A trapper named Harrison stopped by in early November and asked to see inside. Otto showed him the structure, explained the principles, demonstrated how the stones retained heat. Harrison was not impressed. He told Otto it was an impressive root cellar, but no man should live like a badger in a hole. Why spend 6 months building something underground when a proper cabin could be built in a week? Harrison left, shaking his head, and Otto heard later that the man had told everyone at Fort Laramie about the crazy German living in a fancy cellar. A settler family, the Harrisons, different people, established a homestead 3 miles down the valley that October. They built a traditional log cabin in 8 days, a solid structure with a good fireplace and tight chinking. The husband, Thomas Harrison, rode over to see Otto's shelter in late November. He examined the construction, admitted it was well built, but questioned the effort required. His cabin had taken 8 days. Otto's shelter had taken 6 months. Thomas could not understand why anyone would make that choice. Otto tried to explain about thermal mass and insulation, but Thomas just smiled politely and rode home to his log cabin. Winter was coming. Soon everyone would understand. The winter of 1856 began normally. Snow fell in early November, temperatures dropped to the teens and 20s, nothing unusual for the Wyoming Territory. Otto burned small fires in his stone shelter twice a day, morning and evening, each lasting no more than 2 hours. The stones absorbed the heat and radiated it back for hours afterward. He used perhaps a third of the firewood he had burned in previous winters, and the interior stayed consistently between 55 and 60 degrees. He was comfortable, warm enough to work inside without heavy clothing, warm enough to sleep under light blankets. December brought colder temperatures. 20 below became normal. The Harrison family, 3 miles down valley, burned through their woodpile faster than expected. Thomas Harrison mentioned this to Otto during a brief visit in mid-December, said he was cutting more wood every few days to keep up with demand. His cabin stayed warm enough, but it required constant fire. Otto nodded and said nothing. He knew what was coming, could feel it in the way the wind shifted, in the particular quality of the cold that signaled something worse approaching. The extreme freeze arrived on December 23rd. The temperature dropped overnight from 15 below to 30 below. By the next morning it had reached 38 below zero. By Christmas Day it was 42 below. The cold settled over the valley like a physical weight, brutal and unrelenting. Otto woke Christmas morning in his stone shelter, lit his usual small fire, and felt the familiar warmth build as the stones heated. Outside, the world had become lethal. He ventured out briefly that afternoon to check his snares. The cold was unlike anything he had experienced since the winter Friedrich died. It burned exposed skin within seconds. Breath froze in the air. Trees cracked with sounds like rifle shots as sap froze and expanded. Otto checked his snares quickly and returned to his shelter. Inside, the temperature held at 58 degrees. He had burned one small fire that morning, and the heat was still radiating from the stone walls 8 hours later. He added a few more pieces of wood to the coals, not because he needed the heat, but because he wanted to keep the stones fully charged. The fire burned for an hour, then he let it die. That night Otto stood outside his shelter briefly, looking across the valley toward where he knew the Harrison cabin sat. He could not see it in the darkness, but he could see smoke, a thick column rising gray against the black sky. They were burning everything they had. The smoke told a story Otto understood too well. A desperate fire, constantly fed, trying to keep a log cabin warm when the temperature was 40 degrees below zero. He had seen this before. He had lived this before. He went back inside his stone shelter, closed the heavy door, and lay down on his sleeping platform. The stones radiated warmth around him. He fell asleep comfortable and safe. And outside the temperature dropped to 43 below. The pounding on Otto's door came at 2 in the morning on the 4th night of the freeze. He woke instantly, confused because visitors in the middle of winter were rare. Visitors in the middle of the night during a killing freeze were unthinkable. He opened the heavy door and found Thomas Harrison standing in the darkness, 3 children wrapped in blankets behind him, his wife Sarah clutching an infant. Their faces were gray with cold. Thomas could barely speak, his words coming in gasps that created clouds of frozen breath. Their cabin had failed. They had burned everything, furniture, tools, spare lumber. The fire had roared all night, but the cold had won. The children were showing signs of frostbite. Sarah had stopped shivering, which Thomas knew meant she was entering the dangerous stage of hypothermia. They had nowhere else to go. Otto pulled them inside and closed the door. The contrast was immediate and dramatic. Outside, 43 below. Inside, 58 degrees and completely still air. No drafts, no cold spots, just steady warmth radiating from stone walls that glowed faintly in the light from Otto's oil lamp. Sarah Harrison sank to the floor near the stone hearth, pulling her children close. Thomas stood in the center of the space, staring at the walls, at the earth ceiling, at the small bed of coals in the hearth that was barely burning, yet the room was warm. He could not reconcile what he was experiencing with what he thought he knew about shelter and survival. Otto added wood to the coals, not much, just enough to build the fire back up. He gave Sarah hot water he had kept warm near the hearth and helped her remove the children's frozen outer clothing. The 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ranging from 4 to 9 years old, gradually stopped shaking. Color returned to their faces. The infant, wrapped against Sarah's chest, never woke. Within 30 minutes, the Harrison family had transformed from people on the edge of death to people who were simply tired and cold. The stone shelter had absorbed them into its steady warmth. Thomas Harrison spent that night watching the fire burn down to nothing, then watching the temperature inside the shelter remain unchanged. He pressed his hand against the stone walls and felt heat radiating from rock that was 3 feet from the nearest flame. He had built what everyone considered a proper cabin, had done everything right by conventional standards, and it had nearly killed his family. Otto had built what everyone mocked as a cellar, had spent 6 months doing what should have taken a week, and his structure had saved 5 lives without effort. The physics were undeniable. Stone and earth worked. Logs and air did not. The Harrison family stayed for 3 days while the freeze continued. Otto's small fires, burned twice a day for an hour each time, kept everyone comfortable. When the temperature finally rose above 0 and the Harrisons returned to their cabin, Thomas asked Otto to teach him exactly how the stone shelter was built. The mockery was over. The validation was complete. Spring came late to the Wyoming Territory in 1857. Snow remained on the ground until mid-April, and the creeks did not fully thaw until early May. The extreme freeze of December had killed 3 trappers and 2 settler families in the region. Those who survived came out of winter changed, more cautious, more aware of how close they had lived to the edge of death. Word spread about the Harrison family's survival, about Otto Steinman's stone shelter that had saved 5 lives during the worst cold in frontier memory. By the time the snow melted, Otto had visitors. They came alone or in small groups, trappers and settlers who wanted to see the structure, to understand how it worked. Otto showed them freely. He explained the excavation depth, the importance of reaching earth that maintained constant temperature. He demonstrated how the stone walls absorbed and radiated heat, how a small fire could warm hundreds of pounds of rock that would release that heat over many hours. He showed them the thick earth covering that acted as insulation, preventing warmth from escaping. He explained that the principle was simple. Stone holds heat, earth holds temperature. Combine them properly, and you need very little fuel to stay warm. Most visitors listened with interest, but did not commit to building similar structures. The labor was too great, the time investment too substantial. Thomas Harrison was different. He spent 3 days with Otto in May, taking notes, asking detailed questions about stone selection, wall construction, roof engineering. Thomas had nearly lost his family. He would not risk another winter in a log cabin. He returned to his homestead and began gathering stones. By June, he had started excavating. By August, he had stone walls rising from a pit 6 feet deep. By October, he had completed a shelter nearly identical to Otto's, built into a hillside half a mile from his original cabin. His family moved in before the first snow, and Thomas told everyone who asked that he would never sleep in an above-ground cabin again. A trapper named Wilhelm Gruber visited in July. Gruber was an older man, nearly 50, who had trapped in the Rockies for 15 years. He examined Otto's construction with the eye of someone who understood engineering. He asked about drainage, about ventilation, about the structural load the stone walls could support. He left impressed and returned to his own territory in Montana with plans to build a similar shelter before winter. By September, Otto heard that Gruber had completed his structure and was telling other trappers about the design. The knowledge was spreading organically, carried by men who had nearly frozen to death and did not want to face that risk again. Otto spent the summer of 1857 trapping and hunting, living comfortably in his stone shelter, burning minimal firewood even during cold mountain nights. He had proven his theory: stone and earth created shelter superior to wood and air. The question had been answered. The validation was complete. He did not promote his design or try to profit from it. He simply lived, and others learned by watching him survive. Over the next decade, variations of Otto Steinmann's stone shelter appeared across the Northern Territories. Not many, perhaps 24 by 1865, but each one represented a life saved or a family protected. Trappers built them in remote valleys where winter cold could kill. Settlers incorporated the principles into root cellars they could retreat to during extreme weather. Trading post operators built stone-lined storage rooms that maintained stable temperatures year-round. The specific designs varied, but the core principle remained constant: stone for thermal mass, earth for insulation, depth for temperature stability. Otto married in 1858. Her name was Anneliese Weber, a widow who had come west with a wagon train and settled at Fort Laramie. She moved to Otto's Valley in spring of 1859, saw his stone shelter, and understood immediately why he had built it. They expanded the structure that summer, excavating an additional room and extending the stone walls. Their first child, a daughter they named Greta, was born in 1860. 2 more children followed: Hans in 1862 and Liesel in 1864. The stone shelter that Otto had built for survival became a family home. The fur trade had collapsed by the mid-1860s. Beaver were scarce, demand had disappeared, and the mountain man era was ending. Otto transitioned to ranching, running cattle on the valley grasslands during summer, keeping a small herd through winter. His stone shelter, expanded and improved over the years, housed his family comfortably. Visitors who saw the structure often commented on how strange it looked: a grass-covered mound emerging from a hillside with a heavy wooden door and a single small chimney. But inside, the space was warm, dry, and spacious. The stone walls, now decorated with shelves and hooks, radiated steady heat. The earth covering kept temperatures stable regardless of weather outside. By 1870, Otto had stopped trapping entirely. He focused on his ranch, his family, and helping neighbors with construction projects. He never promoted his shelter design formally, but he helped anyone who asked. 3 families within 20 miles had built earth-sheltered structures using principles Otto had developed. The knowledge spread quietly, passed from one frontier resident to another, preserved not in books or formal records, but in actual structures built into hillsides across the territory. Otto Steinmann died in 1883 at the age of 54, not from cold or violence, but from pneumonia contracted during a late spring storm. He was buried on the same hillside where Friedrich Bauer had been laid to rest 28 years earlier. His family continued living in the stone shelter for another decade before eventually building a conventional ranch house nearby. But they kept the original structure maintained, used it for storage and occasional shelter during extreme weather, and told visitors about the man who had built it after watching his partner freeze to death in a cabin everyone thought was adequate. The shelters remained. Some are still visible today: grass-covered mounds in remote valleys, stone walls emerging from hillsides, testament to one man's refusal to accept that traditional methods were the only methods. Otto Steinmann proved that survival was not about doing what everyone else did. It was about understanding principles and applying them regardless of mockery or convention. His innovation was not heroic, it was simply intelligent. And intelligence, applied to the problem of staying alive in a place that wanted to kill you, was worth more than any amount of courage or strength.